crowded bar is supposed to swallow noise, not people. Cameras record movement, not erasure. Yet on a spring night in 2006, a young man walked into a bar in Columbus, Ohio, and quietly dissolved into absence. No exit, no trace, no explanation. Only silence remained where certainty once lived. This is not merely an unsolved mystery. It is a cold case that never truly went cold. A dark past concealed behind neon lights, casual laughter, and a carefully maintained illusion of safety. Tonight, we are not searching for shock or spectacle. We are stepping into the silent spaces where logic falters and certainty dissolves, where familiar environments become unfamiliar and the human mind reveals its most fragile fractures. This is the disappearance of Brian Shaffer, a story defined not by answers, but by questions that continue to linger, breathe, and refuse to be laid to rest. Columbus, Ohio often feels like a city constructed around predictability, particularly near its university districts. The streets follow a quiet logic, orderly and familiar. Movement seems planned rather than spontaneous. Streetlights do not confront the darkness, but gently dilute it, creating an atmosphere where uncertainty feels distant and disruption appears almost out of place. Bars glow with a warm familiarity, promising relief rather than danger. Students move through the night, suspended between ambition and exhaustion, believing their lives are unfolding according to a reliable script. On the surface, this is a city that promises continuity, where tomorrow is expected to resemble today. That expectation of order is precisely what makes disruption feel so deeply unnatural here. Brian Shaffer lived comfortably within that sense of normality. At 27 years old, he was a medical student approaching the final stages of an intensely demanding journey. Years of discipline had brought him close to a profession that symbolized purpose, respect, and stability. His life followed a trajectory that family members and peers admired without hesitation. There was no visible deviation, no alarming uncertainty, only the steady progression of someone becoming exactly who he was meant to be. Those who knew Brian consistently described him as personable and charismatic. He navigated conversations with ease, offering attentiveness rather than dominance. In relationships, he was present and emotionally available, capable of balancing seriousness with a relaxed sense of humor. Medicine was not simply a badge of prestige for him. It was a calling shaped by empathy and a genuine desire to help others. His future appeared carefully structured, responsibly earned, and morally justified. Yet stability, especially psychological stability, is often an illusion maintained by momentum. Only weeks before his disappearance, Brian experienced a loss that quietly dismantled his inner architecture. His mother passed away after a prolonged illness. The death did not arrive violently or suddenly. It arrived slowly, predictably, and with a kind of exhaustion that grief often brings. There were no dramatic scenes, no public breakdowns. Instead, grief entered Brian's life without spectacle and settled in places that were not immediately visible. Grief rarely behaves in ways that align with expectation. Psychology teaches that unresolved grief does not always announce itself through tears or withdrawal. More often, it alters perception, impulse control, and tolerance for risk. A person may continue to function outwardly while their internal narrative quietly fractures. Brian returned to classes, he met friends, he drank socially, he laughed when expected. But something fundamental had shifted beneath that performance. The emotional axis that once kept him balanced no longer held the same weight. Brian's social circle remained intact during this period. His friends saw him frequently and noted no dramatic changes. Among them was Clint Florenth, a longtime companion who would later become one of the last people known to have been with Brian that night. Their relationship appeared ordinary, built on familiarity rather than tension. There were no criminal records, no documented conflicts, no clear motives that would later explain tragedy. What existed instead were subtle dynamics that only gained significance in hindsight. Alcohol played a quiet but important role in that social environment. It softened boundaries, blurred memory, and lowered emotional thresholds. From a psychological standpoint, alcohol creates conditions where perception becomes unreliable and intentions lose clarity. Decisions made under its influence can feel reasonable in the moment while appearing irrational when examined later. It is not a cause, but it is a catalyst that amplifies vulnerability. Brian's life environment mirrored a familiar middle-class American narrative. He came from a supportive family, achieved academic success, and earned community respect. There was no history of violence or instability, yet beneath that surface lived a quieter strain of emotional pressure. Family grief remained largely unspoken. Expectations continued uninterrupted. The structure of responsibility remained intact, even as the emotional foundation beneath it weakened. No one paused to ask whether Brian was still internally anchored. In Confucian philosophy, harmony is often preserved through outward duty, sometimes at the expense of inward expression. Brian embodied this principle almost unconsciously. He continued fulfilling roles and obligations without burdening others with his pain. He did not disrupt social balance by articulating distress. Yet, unexpressed grief does not dissolve simply because it is ignored. It migrates inward, reshaping perception and subtly distorting how the world feels and responds. This inward migration can create a sense of quiet dissonance. The external world remains unchanged, but the internal experience no longer aligns with it. Familiar spaces feel slightly foreign. Routine loses its grounding effect. Meaning becomes thinner, harder to grasp. In such states, individuals are not necessarily suicidal or reckless. They are often simply unmoored, operating on instinct rather than intention. Nothing in Brian's life suggested an approaching ending. There were no farewells, no financial preparations, no abrupt behavioral shifts that typically precede disappearance. And that absence of warning is not comforting. It is deeply unsettling. It suggests that disappearance does not require chaos or explicit despair. Sometimes it requires only timing, vulnerability, and silence. The disturbing implication is not that Brian intended to disappear, but that a series of ordinary conditions may have aligned in a way that made disappearance possible. A brief moment of disorientation, a lapse in awareness that went unnoticed, a choice made without full psychological presence. In a city carefully designed to feel safe, orderly, and predictable, such moments seem implausible, yet they exist, hidden beneath routine and familiarity. Human behavior is not always guided by clear intention. Sometimes it is shaped by fatigue, grief, alcohol, and unspoken stress. When these factors converge, even the most stable environments can become fragile. Normality does not prevent disappearance. It merely conceals how easily it can occur. Brian Shaffer did not live a reckless or fragmented life. He lived a disciplined one. That is precisely why his disappearance continues to resist explanation. It forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Even lives built on structure, intention, and promise are not immune to disappearance. Sometimes, the most unsettling mysteries are born not from chaos, but from silence. March 31st, 2006, unfolded without ceremony. The kind of night that dissolves into memory precisely because nothing announces its importance. Near the Ohio State University campus, bars filled with students releasing the accumulated pressure of exams, expectations, and routine. Brian Shaffer joined friends for what appeared to be a simple night of casual celebration. There was no sense of urgency, no ritual of farewell, no indication that this evening would fracture into permanence. He entered the Ugly Tuna Saloon bar at approximately 1:15 in the morning. It was late, but not unusual. In a college district, time stretches easily past midnight without consequence. The Ugly Tuna Saloon was a familiar space, perched on the second floor of a building that housed multiple businesses. The bar was known for live music, crowded weekends, and an atmosphere that balanced chaos with familiarity. Patrons moved in predictable patterns. Security cameras monitored the primary entrance. Nothing about the location suggested risk. It was a controlled environment, designed to manage crowds rather than conceal danger. Before entering the bar, Brian engaged in a brief conversation with two women standing outside. Surveillance footage later confirmed the interaction. It lasted only moments. There was no visible distress, no agitation, no indication of conflict. Brian appeared relaxed, engaged, and socially present. Psychologically, this moment matters not because of what happened, but because of what did not. There were no signals of fear or urgency. This interaction would later become significant as the last confirmed social contact Brian had with anyone outside his immediate group. Approximately 26 minutes after entering the bar, Brian placed a phone call to his girlfriend. The call connected successfully. There was no recorded argument, no emotional intensity that suggested crises. It was an ordinary check-in, the kind that blends into the background of daily life. After that moment, communication stopped entirely. Brian did not answer calls. He did not send messages. His phone never connected to a network again. His bank cards were never used. His digital footprint ended abruptly, without tapering or transition. At 1:55 in the morning, security cameras recorded Brian standing near the entrance of the bar. The footage shows him calm, upright, and unrestrained. He was not being escorted. He was not in a visible altercation. His posture suggested neither panic nor urgency. That image remains the final verified visual record of Brian Shaffer. No camera footage captured him leaving the building. From a forensic perspective, this absence creates a paradox that continues to define the case. The ugly tuna saloon had a single main exit accessible to patrons, and that exit was monitored by security cameras. Emergency exits were either inaccessible or alarmed. No camera malfunctions were reported that night. No gaps were identified that could easily explain an unnoticed departure. Brian entered a controlled space and, according to available evidence, failed to exit through observable means. Inside the bar, the environment was loud and crowded. A live band was performing, and movement within the space was constant. From a psychological standpoint, such environments reduce individual salience. People become anonymous shapes rather than distinct subjects. This anonymity complicates witness recall. Alcohol further degrades memory encoding, making retrospective accounts unreliable. Even dramatic events can dissolve into noise under these conditions. Brian's friends waited for him. At first, they assumed he had left independently, perhaps to meet someone or return home. Alcohol encourages assumptions and dulls concern. Minutes pass unnoticed, then hours. By the time the bar closed, Brian was no longer a priority. It was not until morning that absence transformed into alarm. Brian failed to appear at work. Calls went unanswered. Messages remained unread. Silence persisted beyond reasonable explanation. When police were notified, a missing person case officially began. Initial assessments considered voluntary absence. In many cases involving young adults, temporary disappearance is not uncommon. Stress, intoxication, or impulsive decisions can lead to short-term disappearance without long-term consequence. But as hours became days, that explanation weakened. Brian left behind personal belongings. He missed obligations he valued. He failed to access money or transportation. His behavior contradicted patterns consistent with intentional disappearance. Investigators returned repeatedly to the bar. Surveillance footage was reviewed frame by frame. Staff and patrons were interviewed. No credible evidence of violence emerged. No altercation was confirmed. No physical trace suggested injury or coercion. The absence of evidence did not clarify the case. It destabilized it. The defining twist of this case does not emerge from any shocking discovery, but from a profound absence. There is no recorded footage showing Brian leaving the bar. There is no verified confrontation, no witness describing a moment of violence, and no physical evidence suggesting injury or restraint. Every expected marker of resolution is missing. The bar, instead of being a transitional space, became a sealed narrative, a closed system in which a single human presence simply ceased to exist. In investigative terms, this absence is deeply destabilizing. A story normally advances through cause and effect, but here that sequence collapses. The narrative does not end. It suspends itself, refusing completion and leaving only unanswered questions where certainty should reside. From a cognitive standpoint, the human mind resists stories without closure. We are conditioned to expect causality, to believe that actions lead to visible outcomes, and that events follow a continuous logic. When this expectation collapses, psychological discomfort emerges. Brian's disappearance forces an unsettling realization. Reality does not always conform to narrative order. Systems built to observe, record, and protect can fail without warning or explanation. In those failures, certainty dissolves quietly, leaving the mind searching for meaning where none is immediately available. The camera did not blink, the door did not open, no alarm sounded. The night simply absorbed him. That absorption unsettles investigators and observers alike, not because it implies something supernatural, but because it exposes the fragility of certainty. The logic of space collapsed, and with it, the assumption that observation guarantees understanding. When that logic fails, reason follows shortly after, leaving only questions suspended in silence. The initial investigation into Brian Shaffer's disappearance followed established protocol, at least on the surface. Police began by securing and reviewing available surveillance footage from the ugly Tuna Saloon and surrounding areas. The footage was examined repeatedly, slowed down, rewound, and analyzed frame by frame. Investigators searched for anomalies in movement, unexplained gaps, or any indication that Brian had exited unnoticed. Interviews were conducted with friends who accompanied him that night, bar staff, security personnel, and patrons who might have crossed his path. Yet despite this procedural thoroughness, no immediate suspects emerged. No physical evidence pointed clearly toward criminal activity. Each question produced another layer of uncertainty rather than resolution. As the investigation progressed, subtle inconsistencies began to surface. Witness accounts varied on details such as timing, location, and sequence of events. Some individuals recalled seeing Brian later than others claimed. Some believed he had already left the bar, while others were uncertain whether they had seen him at all. Alcohol played a significant role in these discrepancies. From an investigative psychology standpoint, intoxication severely degrades memory encoding and retrieval. The smell of alcohol lingered over many statements, not merely as a detail of the night, but as a contaminant of reliability. Under such conditions, testimony becomes fragmented, suggestible, and prone to reconstruction rather than recall. No arrests were made. No persons of interest were publicly identified. The absence of direction gradually transformed the case from an active investigation into a suspended one. For investigators, this lack of narrative posed a structural problem. Without a working theory, investigative resources become difficult to justify. For the family, especially Brian's father, this suspension felt like abandonment. The case hovered in a liminal space, neither resolved nor actively pursued, existing instead as an unresolved question without institutional momentum. Media attention quickly reshaped the public perception of the case. Headlines framed Brian as the man who vanished into thin air, emphasizing the surreal nature of the disappearance rather than its procedural complexity. This framing elevated the case from local tragedy to national curiosity. Internet forums and amateur investigators multiplied rapidly, each offering theories that ranged from psychologically grounded to wildly speculative. In the absence of evidence, speculation flourished. Rational analysis competed with imaginative explanations, and the boundary between inquiry and entertainment blurred. Brian's father responded to this vacuum with relentless action. He organized search efforts, distributed flyers, and pursued leads that authorities had dismissed. He contacted psychics and private investigators, driven not by belief in their methods, but by the refusal to remain passive. In grief psychology, this behavior is not uncommon. When acceptance feels impossible, action becomes a form of survival. His persistence kept the case visible long after official efforts slowed, but it also exposed him to repeated disappointment and false hope. As the investigation matured, three primary hypotheses began to dominate discussion. The first suggested that Brian had voluntarily disappeared. Supporters of this theory argued that grief, academic pressure, and emotional exhaustion may have driven him to abandon his life intentionally. From a psychological perspective, voluntary disappearance typically leaves preparatory signals. Financial withdrawals, changes in behavior, expressions of despair, or logistical planning often precede such actions. In Brian's case, none of these indicators were present. He left behind money, personal belongings, and professional commitments. His digital and financial footprints ended abruptly, without transition or preparation, undermining the plausibility of intentional disappearance. The second hypothesis proposed accidental death or concealed homicide. Advocates pointed to possible blind spots within the bar, human error in surveillance coverage, or the potential for an incident to occur unnoticed amid noise and crowd density. While theoretically possible, this scenario demands an extraordinary sequence of coincidences. It requires that an incident occurred without witnesses, left no physical trace, evaded all cameras, and resulted in a body being removed or concealed without detection. From an evidentiary standpoint, such flawless concealment is statistically rare and unsupported by available data. The third hypothesis introduced the possibility of a third party, unknown to investigators. This theory suggested that someone, unseen by cameras and unnoticed by witnesses, intervened in Brian's trajectory. Psychologically, this explanation appeals because it preserves the assumption of external causality. It allows observers to locate responsibility outside randomness or internal collapse. However, it struggles under evidentiary scrutiny. No credible suspect fitting this description has ever been identified, and no corroborating evidence supports the presence of such an individual. Each hypothesis collapses under closer examination. Voluntary disappearance lacks motive continuity and preparatory behavior. Accidental death demands improbable invisibility. Homicide requires near-perfect execution without error. The absence of evidence becomes the defining feature of the case, transforming uncertainty itself into the primary datum. From an analytical perspective, this is deeply unsatisfying. Investigations rely on accumulation, not voids. Here, the void resists containment. Time became the case's most corrosive force. As months turned into years, memory degraded further. Witnesses relocated, routines changed, and emotional investment faded among those not directly affected. Environmental changes altered the physical context. Renovations, closures, and structural modifications erased subtle traces that might once have held significance. Cold cases often do not fail due to lack of effort, but because information decays faster than certainty can be constructed. At times, previously overlooked details resurfaced, drawing renewed attention from investigators and the public alike. Minor camera blind spots were scrutinized again, and structural irregularities within the building were carefully reconsidered. Each discovery briefly reignited speculation, offering the illusion of progress. Yet none of these elements produced confirmation or resolution. Instead, they deepened the uncertainty. Every rediscovered fragment appeared to promise clarity, only to dissolve into further complexity, reinforcing how resistant the case remained to explanation. The case now exists in a state of permanent suspension. It is not unresolved due to negligence or indifference. It remains unresolved because it resists narrative containment. It defies the frameworks designed to explain disappearance. That resistance may be its most disturbing feature. The investigation did not fail in a dramatic way. It dissolved quietly, leaving behind a question that continues to hover, unanswered, in the space between evidence and understanding. Psychological analysis often begins precisely where verifiable facts dissolve. In the case of Brian Shaffer, the external record ends abruptly, leaving behind a silence that invites interpretation rather than certainty. His internal states cannot be reconstructed with precision, yet psychological patterns allow for informed insight. Human behavior rarely emerges in isolation. It is shaped by cumulative pressures, unresolved emotions, and the fragile coherence of identity under stress. Brian's disappearance exists at the intersection of these forces. Grief is not a singular emotional event, but a restructuring process. When a parent dies, especially after prolonged illness, the loss does more than remove a loved one. It destabilizes an internal framework that once provided orientation. Brian lost his mother only weeks before his disappearance. Outwardly, he continued functioning. He returned to school. He socialized. He drank with friends. Internally, however, grief may have been reorganizing his perception of self and future. Psychology consistently shows that unresolved grief can fracture identity coherence, particularly when combined with high-performance environments such as medical school. Academic pressure intensifies this fracture. Medical training demands sustained focus, emotional regulation, and delayed gratification. It rewards endurance, but leaves little room for vulnerability. For someone already absorbing loss, this environment can magnify internal dissonance. The mind continues forward while the emotional core lags behind, creating a split between performance and presence. Under such conditions, dissociative episodes become more likely. Dissociation does not imply madness or psychosis. It is a protective mechanism. It occurs when awareness narrows to manage overload, decision-making fragments. Perception distorts subtly, rather than dramatically. Individuals in dissociative states may wander without clear intention, misinterpret spatial cues, or lose track of time. They may appear calm externally, while internally disconnected. Importantly, dissociation does not feel dangerous to the person experiencing it. That is what makes it risky. Viewed through this psychological lens, Brian's final confirmed moments acquire deeper significance. He appeared composed, unhurried, and outwardly calm. There was no sign of flight, no visible agitation, no behavior that suggested immediate fear. Yet calmness should not be mistaken for mental clarity. In dissociative states, emotional flattening can mask internal confusion, replacing anxiety with detachment. A person may seem present while operating on diminished awareness. In such conditions, the absence of panic does not indicate safety or intention, but rather a narrowed consciousness that obscures risk and distorts perception. Philosophical traditions offer additional frameworks for understanding this internal distinction. From a Buddhist perspective, suffering arises from attachment and the impermanence of all structures. Brian's life narrative student, son, future physician relied heavily on continuity. The sudden loss of his mother disrupted that continuity. When identity is tightly bound to structure, its collapse produces existential disorientation. The self searches for ground and finds none. In such moments, meaning thins. Action may occur without narrative justification. Christian theology introduces a different dimension. Within its framework, silence often accompanies guilt, grief, and suffering, not because truth is deliberately concealed, but because language fails to restore moral or emotional order. There are moments when confession cannot resolve internal fracture. Silence becomes not an evasion, but an acknowledgement of insufficiency. Applied here, the absence of explanation is not evidence of deception. It may reflect the limits of articulation when internal experience overwhelms symbolic expression. Confucian philosophy further deepens this analysis. Confucian ethics prioritize social harmony, duty, and restraint. Emotional disclosure is secondary to role fulfillment. Brian embodied this ethos. He was responsible. He did not burden others with his struggles. Yet psychology consistently shows that unexpressed distress accumulates like unpaid interest. Eventually, the psyche seeks release. That release is not always rational, visible, or narratively coherent. Sometimes it emerges as withdrawal, disappearance, or behavioral rupture rather than confession. Modern investigative psychology increasingly emphasizes internal processes alongside physical evidence. Traditional investigations focus on exits, cameras, and witnesses. Psychological inquiry asks different questions. Were there timing irregularities, suggesting cognitive drift? Did behavioral cues indicate emotional constriction? Were micro-expressions overlooked because they did not match expectations of distress? These approaches do not replace forensic methods, but they expand interpretive space. Yet even the most sophisticated psychological frameworks eventually reach their limits. Internal mental states leave no physical trace, no measurable imprint that investigators can recover after a disappearance. They cannot be replayed or conclusively reconstructed. What remains is inference shaped by patterns and probability, not verifiable proof. This gap between explanation and certainty does not stay confined to academic analysis. It spills outward into the social and emotional aftermath, where families, communities, and observers are forced to live with unanswered questions rather than conclusions, and where uncertainty becomes the most enduring legacy of the case. Brian's family exists in suspended mourning. Without confirmation of death, grief cannot complete its natural arc. Psychologists refer to this as ambiguous loss, one of the most psychologically taxing forms of grief. It prevents closure. Hope and despair coexist without resolution. The mind oscillates endlessly between possibilities. The city of Columbus also carries an invisible scar. The case altered how safety is perceived in familiar spaces. A bar, a campus district, a routine night out. These environments are designed to feel controlled and predictable. Brian's disappearance undermines that promise. If disappearance can occur without violence, witnesses, or error, then safety becomes conditional rather than assumed. This leads to the most unsettling question, one that is philosophical rather than forensic. Is evil more frightening than disappearance, or is the absence of meaning itself the true horror? Humans have evolved to process tragedy. We grieve, explain, assign, blame, and rebuild. Ambiguity resists all of these processes. It leaves the cognitive system unfinished. Brian Shaffer's disappearance confronts us with the boundaries of human understanding. It reminds us that not every story moves toward clarity or resolution. Some narratives remain unfinished, not because the truth is deliberately concealed, but because reality does not always arrange itself to suit human logic. These unresolved cases linger as subtle disturbances in collective memory. They do not shout or conclude. Instead, they remain quietly present, unsettled, and impossible to fully forget. The fear at the heart of this case does not come from death itself, but from uncertainty. Brian Shaffer became a symbol of unanswered questions, of how easily certainty can dissolve without warning, chaos, or visible violence. His absence reminds us how vulnerable we are to forces that leave no fingerprints, no evidence, and no clear narrative behind. If fear's a mirror, then this story reflects our deep need for order in a world that never guarantees it. Ordinary nights contain invisible thresholds. Familiar places can hide unseen fractures. What protects us is not paranoia, but awareness, the quiet recognition that reality can shift without announcement. If this story unsettled you or made you question how well we truly understand the world around us, remember to like, share the video, and subscribe for more true crime stories that explore the shadows beneath everyday life. Some crimes leave no screams, only questions. And some silences echo louder than any confession. Thank you for listening to Criminal Minds.